Welcome back, or welcome. If this is your first time through a Glass Darkly Radio. The intro music was Mark of the Doomslayer by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. And I have a gigantic amount of material today. I asked for 20 pages, I got 30. I did not expect to get this much material on MK often, but apparently it's out there. So let me just quickly go through any residual comments. Oh boy. Evening, Ginger Norseman. Howdy, howdy, Johnny Topside. Sunday lunchtime here, Spiritual Ascension. Fred is coding while listening. Yeah, thanks. I had to get the mug busted because I had to go on a trip for work. So would have been a good episode to use MK Ultra by Muse as soundtrack. Yeah, Fred, unfortunately, I would get a copyright strike if I did that. Spider Bite, how you doing? How you doing, Logan? Good day, Rain Cry 5217. Thank you for all the haircut. Yeah, the government wants you to know about it. Yeah, probably. Probably. All right. I'm going to get started because I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through this in 2 hours because it's a lot. So here we go. Project MK Ultra, a deep dive into a Cold War occult research program. Project MK Ultra was a secret U.S. intelligence program of the late 1960s and early 1970s, shrouded in intrigue and speculation. Allegedly run jointly by the CIA and Department of Defense, MK Ultra is often described as an offshoot of the notorious MK Ultra mind control projects. Its reputation is distinctive. In addition to drug and behavior experiments, MK Ultra has been reportedly linked to investigations of the occult and paranormal. This report examines MK Ultra's origins, objectives, activities, and termination, drawing on declassified records, credible investigative research, and contrasting these with more speculative claims. We will distinguish well-documented facts from conspiracy theories, assess the reliability of sources, and compare MK Ultra with related programs such as MK Ultra and the Stanford Research Institute's remote viewing efforts, i.e. Project Stargate, Grill Flame, Sunstreak, Setter Lane, and whatever project names it went under. Profiles of key figures, including Dr. Andrea Puharich, which we talked about last week, and the enigmatic Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, are included to illustrate the roles and reputations of individuals at the intersection of U.S. intelligence and esoteric research. Ultimately, this deep dive seeks to present a balanced, evidence-driven narrative of MK Ultra and the broader Cold War impulse to explore unconventional warfare techniques, including those veering into the mystical and occult realms. All right, let's start with the origins of Project MK Ultra. MK Ultra emerged against the backdrop of the CIA's ongoing search for mind control methods and behavioral modification tools during the Cold War. By the mid-1960s, the CIA's original mind control program, MK Ultra, which was launched in 1953, had officially been scaled back and restructured. In 1964, MK Ultra was rolled into a follow-on program codenamed MK Search, which continued CIA drug experimentation under more secrecy. It was under the MK Search umbrella that Project MK Ultra was initiated in the late 1960s. Declassified government documents confirm the basic lineage. MK Ultra is described as, quote, a part of the MK Search project, end quote, with a specific objective to, quote, test the behavioral and toxicological effects of certain drugs on animals and humans, end quote. In other words, MK Ultra began as a pharmacological program, picking up where MK Ultra's chemical experiments left off. The CIA's Technical Services Staff, or TSS, the same unit that ran MK Ultra, initially oversaw many of these behavioral programs. By 1968, however, leadership for certain projects had shifted to the CIA's Office of Research and Development, or the ORD, under Dr. Stephen Aldrich, reflecting an effort to use more scientifically advanced methods to influence the mind. Aldrich had a background in both medicine and clandestine research. He was a veteran of the earlier Project Artichoke program, and under his direction, the CIA continued probing ways to manipulate human behavior with new technology and substances. According to former CIA officer and author John Marks, whose 1979 investigation, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, drew on internal CIA files. Project Ultra was launched in 1968 as a joint venture with the U.S. Army. The Army's Chemical Corps at Edgewood Arsenal, which was a military research center in Maryland, became a key partner in MK Ultra. This partnership was likely driven by practical considerations. The Army had ongoing chemical warfare research and ready access to facilities, scientists, and test subjects, including soldier volunteers, while the CIA had the mandate and funds for exotic behavioral research. Contemporary accounts indicate the Navy was also tangentially involved, contributing a similar drug database project, though the Navy's work appears to have been done independently and not expressly for CIA purposes. Notably, investigations found no evidence that the Air Force participated in MK Ultra or related CIA behavior control projects. So why MK Often, and also its sister project or brother project, who knows, MK Chickwit? In typical CIA fashion, the codename's meaning remains obscure. Some testimony by CIA officials implied that MK Often might have been used interchangeably or in sequence with MK Chickwit, another MK Search subproject focusing on identifying new drugs overseas. CIA Director Richard Helms, in later congressional hearings, even suggested that MK Often was just another name for MK Chickwit, possibly as a way to downplay MK Often's uniqueness. In fact, declassified documents differentiate the two. MK Chickwit, sometimes spelled the following way: Charlie, Hotel, India, Charlie, Kilo, and then Whiskey, India, Tango, two separate words instead of just one, was an effort to scout new drug developments in Europe and Asia and gather samples, whereas MK Often was the arm that tested drugs for behavioral effects. The pair of programs worked in tandem, Chickwit to find interesting compounds and Often to evaluate their effects. This suggests MK Often's origin was part of a broader CIA DoD strategy in the late 1960s to vastly expand the library of mind-altering substances and their potential uses. So what were the objectives and operations of MK Often? MK Often's core mission, as documented in government records, was pharmacological, to assess how various drugs and chemicals affected the mind and behavior. A 1977 Department of Defense memorandum, declassified via FOIA, concisely states that MK Often's objective was, quote, to test the behavioral and toxicological effects of certain drugs on animals and humans, end quote. Field reports and similar summaries show that this mandate was taken literally, ranging from laboratory tests on animals to controlled experiments on human volunteers and the compilation of massive data sets on drug effects. The key activities of MK Often included: 1. Animal experiments. So initial phases of many Often experiments were conducted on animals to observe pharmacological effects. Substances with potentially behavioral altering properties would be screened in animals for toxicity and psychological impact. This was a direct continuation of earlier CIA work. So, for instance, MK Ultra had also done animal tests with LSD and other drugs. By the late 1960s, new drugs such as powerful hallucinogens, dissociatives, and deliriants were becoming available, and MK Often sought to catalog their effects. For example, one newly tested drug was ibogaine, a hallucinogen derived from African plants. MK Often expanded its scope to evaluate ibogaine after starting with more conventional neurochemicals like dopamine. Then there were the human experiments of volunteers. So MK Often also moved to human trials, ostensibly with volunteer subjects. Ostensibly. The Army's involvement made it easier to recruit soldier volunteers at places like Edgewood Arsenal. Indeed, the Army provided military personnel as test subjects for Often experiments. In at least one case, when a particularly potent incapacitating agent was identified, the Army arranged for inmate volunteers at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia to be used in testing. Holmesburg Prison was notorious for permitting medical experiments on inmates in that era, some run by private contractors. Its use in MK Often indicates a crossover between CIA DoD research and civilian institutions. It's worth noting that volunteer status in such experiments was ethically fraught. No Scheiße. Prisoners, for instance, may have volunteered under coercive conditions in exchange for perks. In the Army, we call that voluntold. Nonetheless, these tests aim to see how drugs could induce specific mental states or impairments in real human subjects. Additionally, there was database and data analysis. A less glamorous but crucial component of MK Often was data collection. The project created an enormous database of tens of thousands of chemicals and drugs, according to intelligence historians. The U.S. Army Edgewood Arsenal Labs played a primary role in building a computerized database for drug testing results, using information from both MK Often trials and other Edgewood experiments. By the early 1970s, Edgewood's researchers had compiled extensive human clinical data on various substances, everything from common pharmaceuticals to obscure psychoactive compounds, some of it fed by CIA funding. Interestingly, the Navy was said to have contributed its own data to MK Offen's database as well, though as mentioned, the Army's contribution appears to have been part of a parallel effort. This data-centric approach marked a modernization of CIA mind control research. Instead of ad hoc experiments run by individual professors, as in the 1950s MK Ultra days, MK Offen aimed for a systematic inventory of behavior-modifying agents enabled by early computer technology. Another area that MK Offen focused on was offensive and defensive research. MK Offen was dual purpose. An ORD memorandum described that the project pursued both offensive applications, so obviously using drugs as weapons, and defensive ones, so developing countermeasures to such weapons. Offensively, the CIA and Army were interested in compounds that could derange or disable targets, for instance, drugs to induce temporary psychosis, paralysis, or confusion in enemy personnel. Congressional testimony later indicated MK Offen experiments tried to, quote, disturb a person's psyche and produce, quote, violent or irrational behavior, end quote, or, quote, temporary psychotic states, end quote. One concrete goal was finding a compound that could simulate a heart attack or a stroke in the targeted individual. Such a substance, if delivered covertly, would effectively serve as an untraceable assassination method, making a murder look like natural causes. This chilling objective evokes the infamous CIA pursuit of a heart attack gun and toxin-coated bullets in that era. Defensively, MK Offen researchers also studied how to protect American personnel from chemical incapacitants or poisons, for example, by understanding an enemy's drugs or developing antidotes. The CIA's Office of Research and Development saw both studies as vital. If foreign adversaries or non-state actors used chemical or occult techniques, the U.S. needed to be prepared to counter them. MK Offen also focused on the exploitation of parapsychology and the occult. Here we enter murkier territory. Unlike the clearly documented drug testing aspects, claims that MK Offen actively investigated occult or psychic phenomena are not well supported by official files. However, a number of secondary sources, which we're going to discuss in the next section, allege that beyond pharmacology, MK Offen's operatives dabbled in consulting astrologers, fortune tellers, mediums, Satanists, and other occult practitioners. These accounts suggest the CIA was, at least briefly, willing to explore the world of black magic in an attempt to harness any unusual powers of the mind. It's said, for instance, that Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the famed chemist who led MK Ultra and who was nicknamed Black Sorcerer, personally met with sorcerers and demonologists, and that the agency even sought advice from a Catholic Monsignor who oversaw exorcisms. Later sections will scrutinize these extraordinary claims and their sources. If true, such activities would mark a bizarre expansion of MK Offen's operations beyond conventional science. For now, it is important to note that no declassified document to date explicitly confirms the occult dimension. The known paperwork confines MK Offen's scope to drugs and behavior experiments. In summary, MK Offen's day-to-day operations, as reliably documented, revolved around drug research, designing experiments, dosing subjects, animal or human, recording behavioral changes, and analyzing the results. Its tactical purpose was to find new chemical means to manipulate or derange human consciousness, serving the spy world's needs for both offensive incapacitation and defensive preparation. The project leveraged the CIA's clandestine funding and the Army's research infrastructure to push into frontiers of psychopharmacology. And by the early 1970s, MK Offen had tested a spectrum of substances from stimulants and hallucinogens to putative truth serums and tranquilizers, and compiled one of the most comprehensive databases on psychoactive drugs in the world at that time. Whether it also pushed into supernatural frontiers remains a matter of debate and will be explored a little bit later in this podcast. All right, let's discuss the timeline and termination of MK Offen. Project MK Offen was active roughly from 1968 until 1972 or 73. And these are kind of the known milestones in a timeline of key events. So in 1967 to 1968, this is when there was the genesis of MK Ultra. U.S. intelligence became alarmed by reports of Soviet parapsychology advances and continued their own mind control quest, planning began for new programs under MK Search. By early 1968, a joint CIA Army project that would be dubbed MK Ultra took shape. One source suggests that preparatory work might have even started earlier in the 1960s under different code names. But 1968 is when Project Ultra is first explicitly mentioned in CIA records, at least declassified records. The project likely received an initial classified budget and was placed under CIA/ORD management with Army collaboration. Dr. Stephen Aldrich at CIA/ORD and counterparts at Edgewood Arsenal would have been setting objectives and contracts at this stage. In the late 1960s, the early experiments started. The late 1960s saw MK Ultra commence its drug evaluations. Edgewood Arsenal's labs, which had long been testing chemical agents, including LSD, on soldiers, began adding newly acquired substances from MK Chickwit's global scouting. This is also when civilian contractors may have been brought in for specialized tasks. One declassified report notes a contractor in California was used to identify behaviorally active drugs in 1968 through 1969 as part of a related effort. It's possible that some MK Ultra work, like data processing or compound synthesis, was outsourced to private labs or university under secret contracts. By 1969, CIA scientists were also reportedly interested in exotic poisons, such as tetrodotoxin, okay? The so-called zombie poison from voodoo lore to mimic death-like states, indicating the project's widening scope. So a great movie to watch about tetrodotoxin, I don't even know if I pronounced that right, is a movie called The Serpent and the Rainbow. It's based on a true story. I don't know how much of the story is kind of, how much of it is true, but it's about kind of when Haiti was under Papa Doc Duvalier, and there's a Harvard PhD student or postdoc who goes and has an experience with this crazy zombie poison. Like, it's real. It comes from like a fish. So just highly recommend The Serpent and the Rainbow. Anyway, moving along. So from 1970 to 1971, this was a peak activity for MK Ultra. The project hit high gear in the early 1970s. The database project at Edgewood was in full swing by 1970. Tens of thousands of data points on drug effects were cataloged with CIA funding. For example, Edgewood's database on pharmacological products under MK Ultra was largely completed by 1971. Field experiments also continued. In 1971, a notorious event later alleged by conspiracy writers holds that MK Ultra sponsored a course at the University of South Carolina on black witchcraft, demonology, and voodoo as a social experiment. And this claim comes from researcher Alex Constantine and remains unverified, but it situates itself in 1972 at USC's social laboratory. Whether or not the CIA was really behind it, it reflects the timeline when rumors of occult exploration arise. Meanwhile, drug trials at Holmesburg Prison took place around 1971 to 72, when especially powerful incapacitant was tested on inmate volunteers. It's also during 1972 that we see CIA interest in remote viewing and ESP kick off on a separate track, and this was the SCANATE project at Stanford Research Institute, which began in 1972. Though SCANATE obviously was not part of MK Ultra, it shows the zeitgeist. By the early 70s, the U.S. intelligence community was willing to try any unconventional idea, be it drugs or psychic powers, that might offer an edge. Then in 1972, we have kind of the winds of change year. 1972 was a turning point. In mid-1972, the CIA's longtime TSS chief and MK Ultra architect, Sidney Gottlieb, retired. Around this time, troubling ethical questions of public scrutiny due to leaks about drug testing began to mount within the government. Although still secret, programs like MK often likely encountered internal skepticism about their value and legality. The CIA's director, Richard Helms, was growing concerned that these projects could become a liability. Indeed, in 1972, Helms reportedly ordered a review of all ongoing behavior modification projects. One outcome was that various MK search sub-projects, possibly including Often, were flagged for termination as part of a cleanup before new leadership took over. Then in January 1973, this is the abrupt termination phase. Project MK Often was shut down in January 1973, abruptly canceled, just as CIA Director Helms was leaving office and Dr. James Schlesinger was incoming as the new director. Several sources confirm this date. John Marks notes the timing was directly tied to leadership transition. Helms wanted these sensitive programs ended and their records sanitized before outsiders could discover them. Schlesinger, who succeeded Helms, was known for trying to impose more accountability at the CIA. Helms and Gottlieb, by extension, apparently chose to destroy evidence of the most controversial experiments rather than hand them over. In May 1973, Sidney Gottlieb, with Helms's blessing, destroyed boxes of MK Ultra, MK Often, MK Chickwit, and related files. Gottlieb later testified that he did this to protect the reputations and careers of those scientists involved, essentially admitting that what they had been doing might not withstand public or legal scrutiny. As a result, when the Truth-Seeking Church Committee and other congressional inquiries came knocking in 1975 through 77, very little documentary evidence of MK Often remained in CIA archives. Investigators had to rely on financial records, a few surviving memos, and interviews to piece together what the project had entailed. Then we get to the post-1973 period, the aftermath. Although MK Often was terminated, related research did not cease overnight. The U.S. Army continued some drug testing programs at Edgewood up until 1975, when all human testing there was suspended amid scandal. The CIA, for its part, shifted focus, partly under public pressure, away from large-scale drug experiments and more towards paranormal research and other less overtly physical methods in the mid-1970s. Notably, Project Stargate, an umbrella name for remote viewing programs, officially kicked off under Army DIA management by 1978. Although it wasn't called Project Stargate back then, to my knowledge, it was something like Center Lane or Sunstreak. It's kind of one of those precursor programs. Same program, but different names, because they have to periodically update them, suggesting the CIA was channeling its interest in mind phenomena into different avenues. In short, the end of MK Often marked the end of an era of reckless psychedelic experimentation, even as the broader mind wars continued on other fronts. All right, so let's talk a little about the termination factors. Why was MK Often canceled? Several factors likely contributed. First, there were leadership and security concerns. As mentioned, Director Helms in 1972 anticipated that ongoing programs like MK Often could become a political nightmare. In 1973 came the Watergate scandal and a general climate of distrust of the CIA. Schlesinger and later DCI William Colby were tasked with cleaning house. Schlesinger famously ordered every CIA division to report any activities that might violate the agency's charter or embarrass it. It's during this process that projects like MK Often would have been flagged. The deliberate destruction of records shows that CIA's higher-ups felt MK Often was too sensitive or disreputable to ever be revealed. And then there were a lack of tangible results, allegedly. While MK Often built a big knowledge base, it is not clear that it yielded a magic bullet or a reliable mind control weapon that justified its cost or risk. A CIA ORD veteran later implied they could not say what, if any, success the project had in achieving its wilder aims, like inducing heart attacks. By 1973, after 5 years, MK Often may have been winding down naturally if promising breakthroughs failed to materialize. By the way, if the CIA had the ability to induce heart attacks, there is absolutely, under no circumstance would they admit that publicly, because that would be giving up a capability. There's no way they would admit that. They would lie to Congress or national security claims in order to keep that going. So in CIA's cost-benefit eyes, the program's usefulness might have been in doubt, especially compared to the mounting liability of keeping it secret. Then there's ethical and legal pressure. The early 1970s brought increasing ethical scrutiny to human experimentation. The revelations about the Tuskegee syphilis study, publicly exposed in 1972, and other medical ethics scandals created a climate where secret drug experiments on unwitting subjects, which some MK Ultra and MK Ultra tests essentially were, became utterly unacceptable. Internally, some DoD officials were uncomfortable. One Army legal officer, Lieutenant Colonel E.G. Ben Scott, questioned experiments that aimed at disturbing a person's psyche or inducing violent behavior, implying these goals were disturbing in and of themselves. Such concern from the Army side may have made continuation untenable. By 1975, the Army had issued new guidelines requiring informed consent for experiments, policies utterly at odds with MK Ultra's practices. And then there was potentially overlap with other programs. By the time of MK Ultra's end, the CIA and military might have felt that they had other avenues to pursue similar goals. For instance, Project MK Naomi, a joint CIA-DoD biowarfare program focusing on toxins and bacteria, was also winding down in the early 1970s, but had covered the lethal end of the spectrum. On the mind influence side, research was migrating to electronic and electromagnetic methods. So, for instance, ORD was investigating brain stimulation, microwaves, etc., as indicated by John Mark's FOIA request in 1977. In short, drugs were not the only game in town, and if MK Ultra had sufficiently surveyed the landscape of drugs, the CIA might have decided to move on to other techniques like hypnosis, microchip implants, or psychic spying. Once terminated, MK Ultra effectively disappeared from official view. When Congress held hearings in 1977 on CIA drug programs, Director Stansfield Turner, who by then led the CIA, could only provide scant information. He admitted many files were destroyed and those remaining were fragmented. Turner provided the Senate with what he believed MK Ultra had been, largely echoing the basic drug testing description and noting it ended in 1973. The lack of primary documents meant that even decades later, researchers had to rely on a handful of memos and interviews to reconstruct MK Ultra's story. The dearth of hard evidence helped fuel conspiracy theories that the real scope of MK Ultra was much stranger and perhaps continued in secret. However, based on all available credible evidence, MK Ultra truly did cease operations in early 1973. Its termination coincided with the broader shutdown of MK Search and the final chapter of CIA's first generation of mind control projects. All right, so let's talk fact versus speculation, separating documented reality from conspiracy myth. One of the challenges in studying MK Ultra is that its semi-destroyed paper trail leaves a gap often filled by rumors and speculative accounts. Here we will discuss what is well documented from what is conjectural and evaluate the credibility of sources behind various claims. All right, so here are the documented facts that are well supported by official sources. So, drug testing program. All authoritative sources agree that MK Ultra was fundamentally a drug testing and research program. The 1977 Department of Defense General Counsel's report, obtained via FOIA, and CIA memoranda clearly define MK Ultra in these terms. There is no doubt that MK Ultra involved administering drugs to animals, inmates, and soldiers, and recording the results. The goal of finding incapacitating or mind-altering agents is directly attested in multiple government documents. These documents are considered highly credible. They were internal communications and official inquiries, not intended for sensationalism. Investigative journalists and academics such as John Marks have consistently echoed this core description. We can be confident that MK Ultra was related to drug behavior experiments, and that is a solid fact. Then there's the timeline and links to MK Search. It is also well established that MK Ultra operated roughly from 1968 to 1973 and was part of the MK Search framework. This is confirmed by CIA's own admissions in the late 1970s. For instance, CIA Director Turner in 1977 described MK Search as active until 1973, with sub-projects including those later identified as MK Often and MK Chickwit. The fact that Helms and Gottlieb destroyed MK Often records in 1973 is documented by Helms's testimony and Gottlieb's statements, which in turn were reported by contemporary news. For example, the Washington Post and other outlets covered the CIA's admission of records destruction in September 1977. Thus, the official timeline and end of MK Often are on firm footing. Well, maybe. They didn't kind of quietly continue running these experiments under a different program. The other thing that is firmly backed by the evidence is the use of Holmesburg Prison and Edgewood Arsenal. These specific locations and their involvement are documented and thus factual. The reference to Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia comes from both the DoD report and John Mark's research. Holmesburg was indeed known historically for unethical dermatological and biochemical experiments on inmates led by Dr. Albert Kligman in the 1960s. That MK Often piggybacked on that facility for a particularly effective drug test is quite plausible and is explicitly stated in Mark's accounts. Edgewood Arsenal's central role is beyond doubt. Many declassified Army documents about Edgewood's own medical research volunteer program from 1948 to 1975 have since corroborated that CIA and Edgewood collaborations occurred. The FOIA files even detail how Edgewood created data systems for MK Often and how certain projects were jointly funded. These pieces come directly from primary sources, including DOA memoranda, etc., lending them high credibility. Additionally, there's also firm ground that there were examples of outcomes sought. So the heart attack simulation drug is directly from a CIA source, which was an ORD memorandum via John Marks. Similarly, phrases like disturb a person's psyche or induce temporary psychotic states comes from congressional investigation records. We have these on record in hearing transcripts or investigative reports. So the Vera Institute, the AHRP summary cites those phrases from 1967 hearings and a 2002 article by H.P. Abarelli, which drew on FOIA findings. Therefore, we can consider it factual that MK Often experiments indeed tried to produce severe psychological disturbances and potentially violent behavior as part of testing. These were not benign trials, but aimed at extreme mental disruption. And then leadership and personnel. It is documented that Dr. Sidney Gottlieb was involved in establishing MK Often, at least in its very early stage, as he oversaw all TSS technical projects until 1972. By 1968, Dr. Stephen Aldrich is cited as leading ORD's portion of the research, which suggests Aldrich effectively ran MK Often in practice. Both men are real figures with confirmed roles. Gottlieb's leadership of MK Ultra, MK Search is well known, and Aldrich's succession to oversee behavior control research is also confirmed by CIA records. These are credible, non-controversial points. Where the interpretation comes in is whether Aldrich shifted focus to more occult avenues. And we're going to get to more on that and right now. So speculative or controversial claims. So there's limited or no supporting evidence. Occult and black magic exploration. The most sensational claims about MK Often are that it plunged into studying the occult, Satanism, and paranormal rituals. The prime source of these claims is author Gordon Thomas, particularly his 2007 book, Secrets and Lies. Thomas wrote that Dr. Gottlieb initiated MK Often to, quote, explore the world of black magic, end quote, and, quote, harness the forces of darkness, end quote, supposedly operating on the belief that perhaps the inner reaches of the mind could be reached through occult means. He further alleges that CIA agents met with and recruited every manner of occult practitioner, fortune tellers, astrologers, mediums, witches, warlocks, voodoo, Houngans, even satanic cultists. One particularly colorful anecdote from Thomas's account is that the CIA sought counsel from an official Catholic exorcist in New York, hinting that they were probing demonic possession as a real phenomenon. Okay, so in terms of credibility check, these claims are not corroborated by any declassified document or mainstream investigation. They appear only in secondary sources and tend to be repeated in conspiracy forums and sensational media. Even the military history foundum wiki, which summarizes Thomas, cautions that this is unlikely untrue, or this is likely untrue as there are no other sources on the subject. I don't know if you can assess that. If they want to keep something secret, they'll keep something secret. Indeed, no mention of occult research appears in the 1977 congressional materials or the CIA's own internal summaries of MK Often. The source credibility for Thomas's claims is questionable. Gordon Thomas has written extensively on intelligence history, and while he sometimes had insider sources, critics note he did not always distinguish verified facts from hearsay. Without independent confirmation, the occult angle remains speculative. It may be that Thomas took some rumors or insider anecdotes and dramatized them. For instance, Sidney Gottlieb was nicknamed the Black Sorcerer, but primarily for his poison skills. Thomas perhaps literalized that moniker into a narrative of actual sorcery. In an evidence-driven report, we must label these occult claims as unverified. They should be considered interesting rumors or possibilities rather than established fact. I doubt any author worth his salt, just because they called someone the Black Sorcerer, would leap to a ridiculous conclusion like that. But anyway, I continue. All right, so Project Often-Chickwit, starting in 1962. So researcher Alex Constantine, known for exploring conspiracies, contends that a combined Often-Chickwit operation actually began as early as 1962. He ties it to the Scientific Engineering Institute, SEI, in Boston, a known CIA front lab, and to a bizarre 1972 class at the University of South Carolina on witchcraft, as we noted earlier. He even names a particular asset, British witch Sybil Leek. So that's Sybil and then Leek, L-E-E-K, as allegedly assisting Dr. Aldrich in magical research. Credibility. So again, Constantine's claims may mix fact with speculation. The SEI was real. It did secret work for the CIA, including developing spy camera film and possibly studying paranormal phenomenon. Sybil Leek was a real occult celebrity of the 60s who did visit the U.S., but no evidence directly links them to MK Often except Constantine's word. Constantine does not cite primary documents for these points. His work is generally not peer-reviewed and leans toward conspiracy entertainment. Thus, while it's intriguing to imagine CIA-funded witches casting spells in a social laboratory, there's no declassified record of such. So ChatGPT wants to say this falls under so this falls under conspiracy theory, possible but not proven, and coming from a source with a clear sensational bias. So it's possible. Okay, we can't even say if it's probable or not. Then there's the Rockland Project and data on psychics. Another claim from Constantine and echoed by occult writer Peter Levenda. Look, if Peter Levenda says it, it's got some credibility. Is that MK Often was behind something called the Rockland Project, a supposed repository of psychiatric and personality test data from New England in the late 60s. This is said to have operated via front organization, Psychological Assessment Associates in Washington, D.C. The implication is that MK Often gathered psychological profiles, maybe to screen for psychic ability or vulnerability. So again, there's not much public information about a Rockland Project. Psychological Assessment Associates, however, did exist. Notably, it was a CIA-funded cutout that administered personality tests. As part of other CIA programs, it was associated with Dr. John Gettiger's personality assessment system in MKUltra. It's plausible some data collection happened through that front, but tying it specifically to MK Often is speculative. The reliable sources on PAA don't mention occult members, just psychological testing. So this claim resides in a gray zone, a kernel of truth. CIA did collect psych data, wrapped in conjecture. It was part of MK Often and aimed at paranormal ends. Without further evidence, it remains a speculative hypothesis. All right, so Peter Lavenda's version, who we've interviewed on this channel multiple times. In fact, because his name's coming up in this particular case, I might reach out to him and try to do an episode on MK Ultra with him, and just so we could dive a lot deeper. But his version is Cameron's lab and occult expansion. Peter Lavenda, an author known for exploring occult history in the context of intelligence, so this is his Sinister Forces trilogy, offers yet another narrative. He suggests MK Ultra began in 1969 under Gottlieb right after the CIA black-bagged the laboratory of Dr. Ewan Cameron in Canada. Dr. Cameron was a psychiatrist notorious for MK Ultra Subproject 68, involving brutal psychic driving experiments in Montreal. The idea that CIA stole his lab data as he left is a rumor. Lavenda claims that after 1969, MK Ultra's purview expanded into everything from seances and witchcraft to remote viewing and exotic drugs. In his view, MK Ultra became a grab bag for all things paranormal and weird that the CIA wanted to try. Lavenda's works are extensively researched, but often speculative and conspiratorial in tone. He cites some sources, but also extrapolates. The notion that MK Ultra absorbed all fringe inquiries, even ones like remote viewing, which in reality were handled separately by a different office, is not supported by organizational records. For example, the CIA's remote viewing program was in the Office of Technical Services and later the DIA, not under ORD by the time it formalized. Lavenda's claim likely conflates multiple programs under the MK Ultra umbrella for effect. While he correctly points out that in 1969 the CIA was indeed broadening research into many odd areas, attributing it wholesale to Ultra is oversimplified. This highlights how definitions blur in literature. MK Ultra can become a catch-all label for any spooky CIA endeavor from that time frame. Without independent verification, Lavenda's portrayal should be regarded as tenuous. It's an intriguing narrative, but not one we can confirm through declassified evidence. And then continuation after 1973. So, the speculation that MK Ultra lives on. Some theories have implied that even though MK Ultra was officially terminated, its work continued sub rasa or was folded into other codename projects. A common trope in conspiracy circles is that MK Ultra never truly ended. Well, remote viewing never truly ended, right? So, but can we prove that with declassified documents? No, of course not. Anyway, the same thing applies here. So instead, there's contentions it went deeper underground or into private contractor channels, possibly reappearing in later phenomena, like alleged 1980s programs involving occult crime or monarch mind control. Again, there's no concrete evidence of MK Ultra activity after 1973. In fact, by the late 1970s, CIA officers were candidly telling investigators that they had nothing more on MK Ultra beyond what was in MK search files, or the MK search files. The mid-70s investigations were extensive. It's unlikely an entire continuing program would have escaped notice unless it was moved wholly out of government. Some suggest maybe the private sector or Pentagon took it over. While we can't disprove a secret continuation, there's no documentation or whistleblower testimony specifically attesting to MK Ultra-like work after 1973 under that name. By contrast, the remote viewing program did continue, and we have lots of documents for it, indicating that when things continued, they eventually left a trail. MK Ultra's trail ends, reinforcing that the project concluded as stated. Well, I think it's speculative to conclude that, to be honest. Especially if they got further along than would be surprising. Thus, any post-1973 continuation claims are highly speculative and not grounded in known sources. Okay, so summarizing what we discussed above, we have tiers of reliability. So primary official sources, these are high credibility. FOIA released documents like the 1977 DoD memo, CIA internal memos, Senate hearing transcripts. These uniformly describe MK Ultra in prosaic, drug testing terms and give no hint of occult research. They are factual baselines. Let's just be clear here. What was revealed in these official sources is what the U.S. government was comfortable letting the population know. There's no way they're going to talk about how they explored voodoo and hoodoo and houdon and all voodoo and all this other kind of crazy, other kind of stuff. They're just not, right? So like what you saw as everything in government, and look, I don't know for sure, but anything that comes out where the U.S. government's doing something sketchy is highly sanitized. Okay. And I have no doubt it was the same here. All right. So in terms of established journalistic and academic sources, these are high to moderate credibility. So John Marks' The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, the Washington Post 1977 article Psychic Spying by John L. Wilhelm. There's a Wired magazine piece by Katie Drummond in 2010 summarizing newly released files, and works by historians like Stephen Kinser, Poisoner in Chief, which was on Sidney Gottlieb. These sources base their accounts on documents and or direct interviews. Marks, for example, cites specific CIA documents, number 455, in a 1977 memo by DOD's Dean Seymour about these programs. When they don't mention occult aspects, it's likely because they found none in evidence, and also it's likely that the CIA disclosed none of them. We consider their content reliable. Marks explicitly notes that by 1968, Aldrich, not Gottlieb, ran often and was seeking a heart attack chemical, a sober detail that matches FOIA info. Thus, mainstream researchers lend no support to the wild claims, which suggests those claims truly lacked evidentiary basis. Yeah, in the public record. All right, then there are variable credibility from insider testimony and whistleblowers. We actually have little in the way of direct insider leaks on MK Often, unlike MK Ultra, where a few insiders like Victor Marchetti or John Stockwell later gave hints. MK Often didn't have a prominent person come forward solely about it. The closest might be statements by Colonel John Alexander or others in military paranormal research, but they usually discuss Army psychic projects, not MK Often per se. One could consider Sidney Gottlieb's and Stanfield Turner's 1977 testimonies as insider confirmation of MK Often's content, and they confirmed only drugs, no occult. In absence of whistleblowers backing the occult angle, those claims rest on shaky ground. If, say, a retired CIA officer had ever said, yes, we did hold seances under MK Often, that would change things, but none has publicly. And then the lowest credibility are going to be conspiracy literature authors. So this category includes Gordon Thomas, Alex Constantine, Peter Levenda, W.H. Boart, and others who have written about the CIA and the occult. They are often passionate and creative investigators, but their works are not rigorously footnoted with verifiable sources on these points. For instance, Thomas doesn't reveal who told him about fortune tellers and MK Often. It could be an anonymous source or simply narrative flair. Alex Constantine is explicit about weaving together known facts with conjecture, often to shock the reader. We must treat their claims as interesting possibilities at best and misinformation at worst. Not everything they write is false, but without corroboration, one cannot treat it as reliable. They often reinforce each other's stories, and then later writers citing Gordon Thomas as if it's evidence when it really is one secondary source quoting another. In evaluating MK Often's lore, the balance of evidence favors a view that MK Often was primarily about drugs, and that if any occult experiments occurred, they were tangential or small scale and left almost no trace. Or they were extensive and the results were shocking, and the CIA continues to use them and wants to keep them hidden because they represent a decisive capability against our adversaries. Just throwing that in there. The most extreme stories, for instance, the CIA tried to summon demonic forces under MK Often, are likely exaggerations or symbolic metaphors. It is telling that a CIA inquiry in 1977 actually did search for files on parapsychology and related topics in ORD's archives. This shows Congress had heard rumors and wanted to check. And the CIA's response was a list of boxes of behavioral research, but nothing like we consulted a witch. Had solid evidence of occult activities existed, it would likely have surfaced during those inquiries, unless they put all the documents in burn bags, guys, right? So in conclusion, we label the well-documented facts, drug testing, timeline, aims, as confirmed reality supported by credible sources. The more fantastical, occult, and psychic elements of MK Often are unsubstantiated claims. Totally fair. We present them as part of MK Often's mythology, clearly noting they come from less verified sources. Understanding this distinction is crucial. It prevents us from distorting history with unfounded tales while acknowledging the cultural impact those tales have. Indeed, MK often has become semi-legendary, largely due to those occult rumors. Doesn't mean the rumors aren't true, right? So let's keep an open mind in both directions. All right, so now let's talk about MK Ultra in context, comparison with MK Ultra and the SRI remote viewing programs. Project MK often did not exist in a vacuum. It was one node in a web of Cold War research programs exploring mind manipulation and fringe phenomena. To fully grasp MK Often's character, it's illuminating to compare and contrast it with its infamous predecessors, MK Ultra, and with the roughly contemporaneous remote viewing programs, often associated with Stanford Research Institute, or SRI. We will see that while there are thematic overlaps, all three dealt with non-traditional means of intelligence gathering or warfare, there are significant differences in methods, focus, and oversight. All right, so MK Offen versus MK Ultra. So MK Offen can be viewed as a descendant or spin-off of MK Ultra. MK Ultra was launched in 1953 as the CIA's umbrella program for mind control experiments, spanning 149 sub-projects over a decade. It was overseen by the CIA's Technical Services Staff, again, TSS, under Sidney Gottlieb. MK Ultra ranged from drug studies, most notoriously LSD on unwitting subjects, to hypnosis, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, and beyond. By 1963, MK Ultra in name was phased out and reorganized due to internal criticism and fear of exposure. In 1965, it became MK Search, which served as an umbrella for continuing projects. MK Offen was one such project under MK Search, focusing on drug effects, whereas another, MK Chickwit, focused on sourcing drugs. So in hierarchy, MK Ultra was the forebearer, and MK Offen inherited part of its scope. MK Ultra and MK Offen both were concerned with behavioral modification, but MK Ultra's scope was broader and arguably more exploratory. MK Ultra's objective, per CIA documents, was to develop ways to control human behavior through any means, chemical, biological, or psychological. It famously invested in LSD and other psychedelics, trying to find truth serums, memory erasers, or programming techniques for potential Manchurian candidates. It also delved into hypnosis, psychological torture, and even radiation experiments. MK Offen, in contrast, was narrower, concentrated on drugs and chemicals specifically. No evidence MK Offen directly did hypnosis or implant experiments. Those were elsewhere. One can say MK Offen continued the drug research thread of MK Ultra, but not the entire tapestry of MK Ultra. Both programs were highly secret and ethically egregious by today's standards. MK Ultra was infamous for dousing unwitting civilians with LSD. So, for instance, the CIA's own safe house experiments where johns and prostitutes were given LSD without consent. MK Offen, as far as records show, used volunteers, soldiers, and prisoners, which, while still ethically dubious, prisoner consent is problematic, is a shade less heinous than surreptitiously drugging people. By the late 60s, public climate made experimentation harder. So MK Offen likely did not perpetrate something as extreme as the famous MK Ultra incidents, like Frank Olson's alleged LSD poisoning or the mass poisoning of a French village, both MK Ultra-linked events. However, MK Offen did aim to cause harm, temporary, to its volunteers to observe effects. So, for instance, causing psychotic episodes, which is ethically hardly better. Another difference, MK Ultra used a vast network of front organizations and unwitting researchers, which included universities and foundations given grants without knowledge of CIA sponsorship. MK Offen seems to have been more in-house or clearly contracted. Edgewood New Army, CIA were behind it, for instance. This hints at a structural change after MK Ultra was partially exposed in 1963 in a CIA Inspector General report. The agency likely kept MK Offen on a tighter leash with less outsourcing to oblivious academics. In terms of outcomes, neither MK Ultra nor MK Offen developed a mind control miracle. MK Ultra did manage to develop some coercive techniques, for instance, use of LSD in interrogations. The results were inconsistent. It also pioneered assassination devices, the poison dart gun, etc. But as of 1973, the CIA admitted that no effective knockout pill or mind control serum was found. MK often similarly did not find a perfect behavioral control drug, though it compiled data. Nothing public suggested it found the holy grail of a drug to remotely trigger a heart attack or instant insanity. In fact, a U.S. Army review in the 1980s of the Edgewood Arsenal drug experiments concluded that while drugs like BZ, which was a delirium-inducing agent, could incapacitate people, their effects were too unpredictable for battlefield use. That implies MK Ultra's line of inquiry hit practical roadblocks, much as MK Ultra's LSD tests ultimately did. In terms of public exposure, MK Ultra became world famous after the 1975 to 77 congressional hearings and the subsequent media coverage. MK often, in contrast, remained relatively obscure. Helms had successfully purged most records, and so MK often was mentioned only briefly in Senate reports. For example, the 1977 Senate hearings on CIA drug experimentation, which is Kennedy's subcommittee, focused on MK Ultra. MK often was referenced in passing as an adjacent project that had been terminated. Thus, MK Ultra stands in history books as a CIA mind control program, where MK often is often omitted or footnoted. It only later entered public imagination via those speculative accounts. This disparity is partly because MK Ultra's abuses were better documented. So, for instance, the tragic death of Dr. Frank Olson in 1953 after a covert LSD dose became a high-profile case, whereas MK Ultra's potentially dangerous experiments left no known direct victims willing to come forward. MK Ultra and the occult. It's worth noting that MK Ultra itself had a few sub-projects that touched on the paranormal or fringe science, such as experiments in ESP and telepathy in the 1950s. For instance, researcher Dr. Andrea Puharich, whom we profile later and who I talked about last week, received Army and possibly CIA support to study psychic phenomena and mushrooms that might enhance psychic abilities, i.e. psilocybin. These efforts were quite separate from the main drug programs, but show that even MK Ultra entertains occultish topics at its edges. MK often might have inherited some of that curiosity. For example, Stephen Aldrich, who took over ORD, was known to have interest in parapsychology, and he greenlit some ESP research on the side. The difference is that MK Ultra's forays into paranormal were minor footnotes crowded out by LSD and hypnosis work, whereas in MK Often's legend, the occult looms large, though in reality, maybe not. In sum, MK Ultra was in continuity with MK Ultra in that it pursued the same ultimate goal, which was influencing human behavior against the will. But it represented a streamlined, more specialized effort focusing on pharmacology and undertaken jointly with the military. MK Ultra was broader, more brutal in some ways, and more clandestine in terms of involving unwitting civilians. MK often had a flavor of a more formal research program with data banks, scheduled testing, albeit secret. Both ended in the early 1970s as the moral and strategic calculus changed. Okay. Then we have MK Often versus SRI's remote viewing program, or Project Stargate. While MK Often was evolving on the East Coast labs, another unusual program began on the West Coast, the remote viewing research at Stanford Research Institute, SRI, in California, which later became known by umbrella names like Stargate, Grill Flame, Sunstreak, etc. Center Lane. This is the U.S. attempt to use psychic abilities, ESP, for intelligence gathering, effectively psychic spies. Though not directly connected to MK Often, both can be seen as parallel responses to Cold War pressures to leave no stone unturned, even paranormal ones, in the search for strategic advantage. Here's how they compare. So in terms of agency sponsorship, MK Often was primarily a CIA program with DoD help. The SRI remote viewing program started with CIA funding. The CIA initiated Project Scanate in 1972, contracting SRI. However, by the late 1970s, the remote viewing work shifted to the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the DIA, and Army Intelligence under code names Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, eventually Stargate. So MK Often and the psychic program overlapped in time around 1972 to 73 when both were under some CIA purview. After MK Often ended, the CIA's interest in parapsychology continued in the form of support to SRI and later intermittent oversight of the Army DIA efforts. By contrast, MK Often did not extend beyond 1973, whereas Project Stargate continued up to 1995 under Army DIA management. In terms of goals, MK Often's goal was offensive defensive use of chemicals to alter minds or behavior. The remote viewing programs was collecting information at a distance using psychic viewers. In essence, MK Often tried to change people's minds, while remote viewing tried to read people's minds or at least spy on targets psychically. There's remote influencing too, where you can change people's minds, but we'll let that one go. These are very different operational uses. One is a weapon, the other is an intelligence tool. Remote viewing's focus was on things like describing secret Soviet facilities or locating hostages using clairvoyance. It was not about influencing or harming. That's not true. It's just if you talk to some of the remote viewers like Lynn Buchanan, remote influencing was a thing. But anyway, it was not about influencing, at least remote viewing was not about influencing or harming anybody, which made it, at least in intent, more benign than MK Often's drug tests. In terms of methodologies, MK Often relied on hard science and biochemistry, albeit applied in clandestine ways. It used lab experiments, controlled placebo designs, pharmacological assays, etc. The remote viewing program, in contrast, used psychic experiments. It involved training individuals in techniques to clear their mind and describe images or coordinates, often with elaborate protocols to verify if their visions matched reality. Scientifically, remote viewing was far more controversial since it challenged known laws of physics and neuroscience, which, the idea of obtaining information without sensory contact. MK Often's experiments, while ethically dubious, stayed within the realm of pharmacology, which has reproducible, measurable outcomes. So, for instance, drug X caused 5 out of 6 subjects to become catatonic, which is a measurable result. Remote viewing experiments often produced qualitative data and were hard to quantify. Success was hit or miss and often subjective. In terms of personnel and key players, MK Often was run by spooks and military scientists, so CIA chemists, Army toxicologists. Its operatives were chemists like Sidney Gottlieb and Stephen Aldrich, and presumably medical doctors at Edgewood. The psychic research involved a different crowd: physicists and laser scientists turned paranormal researchers like Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ at SRI, and a cadre of purported psychic individuals like Ingo Swann, Pat Price, and Uri Geller. These people were not spies per se, though a few Army personnel like Ed Dames and Joseph McMonigal became remote viewers in the 1980s. The culture was different. MK Often staff probably wore lab coats and worked with animals in cages. The SRI team meditated in shielded rooms and read Zen literature. One interesting intersection: Andrea Puharich, who was decades earlier involved in Army Psi research, also brought Uri Geller, the celebrity spoonbender, to the attention of the SRI program. So there's a human link through figures like Puharich, who span both the drug and Psi realms. But by and large, MK Often was the domain of pharmacologists, while SRI was the domain of parapsychologists. In terms of results and efficiency, both programs had ambiguous results. MK Often did find drugs that could alter behavior, but nothing that was both controllable and useful enough to deploy operationally. For example, delirium drugs like BZ, which is 3-quinnuclididyl benzylate, could impassagate. Yeah, I think it's 3-quinnuclidinyl benzylate, could incapacitate soldiers, but they were unpredictable and could cause lasting harm. Not exactly the clean mind control tool the CIA wanted. The remote viewing program had sporadic hits, like viewer Pat Price describing a Soviet crane at a secret site with eerie accuracy, but also many misses, and the reliability of the phenomenon was never scientifically proven to skeptics' satisfaction, and it never will be, because the bar is, ridiculous. In 1995, when the CIA finally sponsored an external review of the Stargate program, the conclusion was that while a few results were statistically above chance, remote viewing was not reliable enough for actionable intelligence. That's what they said publicly, but they continue to do it privately and clandestine and covertly. The CIA consequently terminated Stargate in 1995. In short, neither MK Ultra nor Stargate yielded a decisive game changer for intelligence. MK Ultra's chemical tools were too blunt or hazardous. Stargate's psychic tools were too inconsistent and scientifically contentious. And there's oversight and public knowledge. The psychic programs had an odd mix of secrecy and slight openness. Initially classified by the mid-1980s, some information about the Army's remote viewing leaked. There were media reports and even a book, Mind Reach, by Putoff and Targ, describing their early work in somewhat open terms. By the 1990s, the existence of psychic spies was semi-public, culminating in the CIA's 1995 disclosure of Stargate files. MK Ultra, on the other hand, remained almost entirely secret until long after it ended. Only in the 2000s, with more FOIA releases like the 17-page DoD memo in 2010, did more details emerge to the public. The average person still has never heard of MK Ultra, whereas MK Ultra and even men who stare at goats, a reference to Army psychic units, entered pop culture. Oversight-wise, the psychic research, especially once under DIA, had to justify itself periodically to Congress for funding. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, it nearly got axed multiple times. MK Ultra was never in front of a committee while active. It was too secret and short-lived to face annual scrutiny. Then there were thematic differences. MK Ultra represents the technological approach to mind warfare using biochemistry as a tool. The remote viewing effort represents the esoteric approach investigating ancient claims of psychic powers anew, but under scientific protocols. Interestingly, this Cold War had room for both. The Soviets reportedly did the same. They had extensive drug and psychological torture programs and a robust parapsychology research program. The U.S. mirrored that spectrum. MK Ultra and Stargate can be seen as complementary extremes, one rooted in material science, the other in the possibility of the paranormal. In terms of interconnections, although separate, there were subtle interconnections. For instance, Charles Savage, a Navy psychiatrist in the 1940s, had done early LSD studies for a precursor to MK Ultra and also did hypnosis research. Similarly, some MK Ultra projects delved into ESP. Andrea Puharich, as mentioned, was an Army doctor at Edgewood, where MK Ultra later operated, and also deeply involved in parapsychology. He actually organized seances and tried to communicate with supposed alien intelligences, i.e. the Nine, in the 1950s. Well, not officially MK Ultra, and people like him provided a conduit of ideas between the pharmacological and psychic domains. So one could say MK Ultra and the remote viewing program occupied the same universe of CIA's high strangeness research, even if they were distinct projects. It's conceivable that informal information sharing occurred. So, for instance, if MK Ultra scientists grew curious about ESP, they might have liaised with the SRI team and vice versa, discussing whether chemical substances could enhance psychic ability. In fact, Putoff and Targ reportedly tried giving viewers mild drugs like caffeine to see effects, and Puharich believed mushrooms could enhance telepathy. All right, now we're gonna go down a path I have never gone before, and I am just as curious as you all about this particular figure. Then there's Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino's perspective. A curious figure to mention in comparison is Lieutenant Michael Aquino, and we'll profile him in a little bit more detail later in this radio segment. But by the early 1980s, Aquino was a PSYOP officer who was aware of the Army's psychic research, but personally skeptical of remote viewing. In a 1980 memorandum entitled Mind War, Aquino critiqued the Stargate program, noting that Stargate attempted remote viewing experiments which failed, attributing the failure to physics, the inability of brainwaves to project at intercontinental distances. His stance is notable. As an occultist himself, one might expect him to endorse psychic phenomena, but in this case, he did not. Aquino advocated for other psychological influencing strategies like propaganda and electromagnetic weapons rather than ESP. This illustrates how even within the occult-friendly military circles. Remote viewing had its doubters. By contrast, almost no one in the CIA doubted that drugs could affect behavior. That was a given. They doubted control and precision, but not the fundamental effect. Psychic research had to fight for credibility much harder. In summary, MK Often and the SRI Stargate remote viewing program were two very different solutions to the same problem: how to gain an advantage in a conflict of ideologies and intelligence. One tried to chemically subvert the enemy's mind or protect one's own. The other tried to psychically discern the enemy's secrets. One was grounded in pharmacology, with all the ethical baggage of human testing, the other in parapsychology, with the scientific baggage of unproven phenomena. They operated in parallel for a brief overlap around 1972 to 73, but then diverged. By the time remote viewing was peaking in the early 1980s, MK Often was long gone, and chemical mind control, at least officially long gone, and chemical mind control research had largely been shelved due to the fallout from the 1970s revelations. This contrast highlights the evolving approach of U.S. intelligence. When one avenue, drugs, becomes untenable, they explored another, ESP. In the end, neither yielded a decisive edge, and both are today subjects of historic curiosity and cautionary tales about the lengths to which Cold War paranoia drove intelligence agencies. All right, then there's the key figures in MK Often and related programs. The shadowy nature of programs like MK Often means few individual names were made public. However, two figures stand out due to their involvement in the broader landscape of Cold War occult and psychic research: Andrea Puharich and Michael Aquino. While neither man was the director of MK Often, each had roles or reputations that intersected with the themes of these programs. Here, we're going to profile them, outlining their contributions and how they are viewed in relation to MK Ultra, MK Often, and psychic warfare efforts. So for some of you, when we go through Dr. Andrea Puharich, there's going to be a lot of repetition from yesterday, but I'll just try to get through it quickly. You can watch an entire 2 hours on them if you go to last week's episode. So Dr. Andrea Puharich, parapsychologist and occult research pioneer. So Andrea Puharich was an American physician and parapsychological researcher whose life leads like a bridge between military science and the paranormal. Puharich is best known for introducing famed psychic Uri Geller to the United States and for his investigations into psychic phenomena and psychedelics. His relevance to MK Often and similar programs lies in his early role in exploring whether paranormal abilities could be weaponized or enhanced. Essentially, he was doing psychic and occult research for the U.S. Army a decade before MK Often was conceived. Puharich's credentials and career straddled conventional and unconventional fields. He earned an MD from Northwestern University in 1947 and was a practicing physician. Uniquely, he was also deeply interested in telepathy, clairvoyance, and shamanism during the Korean War era, when U.S. military and intelligence began worrying about Soviet brainwashing and psychic research. Puharich stepped forward as a kind of consultant on the paranormal. From 1953 to 1955, he served on active duty as a captain in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, assigned to the Army's Chemical Center at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. This is the same Edgewood Arsenal that later hosted MK Often's drug tests. An interesting continuity. While at Edgewood, Puharich functioned as chief of the outpatient clinic, but in parallel, he was presenting papers on the possible military usefulness of paranormal phenomena. In other words, the Army had him research whether psychic abilities could aid defense or espionage. During that time, Puharich and his circle, he founded a private lab called the Round Table Foundation in Maine, investigated a range of fringe topics: faith healing, psychic surgery, ghost hauntings, telepathy with animals, and psychedelic substances like Amanita muscaria mushrooms, which he wrote about in his book, The Sacred Mushroom, in 1959. Remarkably, some of his work had secret military patrons. For example, Puharich was tasked by the Army to find mushrooms that might unlock psychic powers, essentially a dual interest in pharmacology and ESP that prefigures MK Often's combination of drugs and the mind. There are hints that MK Ultra's Subproject 8 in the early 1950s funded an exploration of hallucinogens and telepathy. While not confirmed by name, many suspect Puharich was involved, given his Army role and interest. Indeed, the New Republic article on government occult research states in the early 1950s, the Defense Department tasked Henry Andrea Puharich with locating mushrooms that they believed might unlock psychic powers, a project the CIA was also working on under MK Ultra. This strongly suggests Puharich was a crossover figure funded by both Army and CIA to test the nexus of psychedelics and ESP. Puharich's reputation in these programs is somewhat paradoxical. On the one hand, he was respected enough to be an insider. He interacted with top brass at the Pentagon, CIA, and Navy during his Edgewood stint. He even hosted seances where prominent military officials allegedly observed purported psychic phenomena. One notable story, in 1952, Puharich held a seance with an Indian mystic, during which a channeled entity called the Nine spoke, present where aerospace engineers and perhaps intelligence folks intrigued by such things. Okay. This sounds fantastical, but it's documented that Puharich indeed had a following in high places who were curious about the paranormal. On the other hand, many in the scientific community viewed him as a dubious character, too credulous, or even a charlatan. Within the government, Puharich's work was classified in parts. The New Republic notes much of his early research remains classified under Atomic Energy Commission rules. Oddly enough, this suggests he was involved in projects of national security interest. However, as years went by, Puharich left active duty and pursued independent research. He famously investigated and championed Peter Hurkos, a Dutch psychic claiming post-injury powers, and later Uri Geller, the Israeli spoonbender. In 1971 to 1973, Puharich played a pivotal role in Geller's testing at SRI. He essentially brought Geller to the SRI scientists and vouched for his abilities. CIA memos from 1973, released decades later, show that while some CIA officers were fascinated by Geller's apparent feats, others were skeptical. Puharich was in the former camp, fully convinced of Geller's authenticity, and he wrote a book, Uri, in 1974, defending Geller. So how does Puharich tie to M.K. Offen? Directly, he does not appear in the declassified M.K. Offen files by name, but thematically, he was a trailblazer for exactly the kind of things M.K. Offen and related projects touched. Consider, M.K. Offen in the conspiracy version was about psychics and witches. Puharich had already worked with psychics and studied shamanic drugs decades before. It is not a stretch to guess that CIA and Army personnel involved in M.K. Offen knew of Puharich's work or even consulted him informally. For instance, Dr. Stephen Aldrich of CIA ORD, who ran MK Offen, had been part of Project Artichoke in the 1950s, which overlapped with Puharich's era. If Aldrich wanted to explore fringe topics, Puharich's findings on how mescaline or mushrooms influenced telepathy experiments would have been of interest. Moreover, Puharich remained connected to intelligence friends through the 60s. Even as a civilian, he was a node between the occult world and military intel circles. In terms of reputation, Puharich's reputation is mixed. To believers and some insiders, he was a visionary who courageously researched areas others would not. They credited him for discoveries like introducing psychic surgery, though he later debunked a fraudulent medium in one case, and early work on extremely low frequency waves affecting the brain. He wrote about Soviet ELF mind control beams in the 1970s, a topic that foreshadowed later HARP conspiracy theories. To skeptics, Puharich was at best naive, at worst a fraud. Many scientists dismissed the dramatic seances and UFO contacts he claimed. He seriously wrote that he was in touch with extraterrestrial intelligences who communicated through the Nine. Even Uri Geller, while grateful to Puharich, distanced himself a bit from Puharich's more outlandish claims like alien communications. Within the government, he was probably seen as useful but eccentric. The fact that much of his army-related work remained classified hints that it was taken seriously enough to conceal, even if it yielded little. He certainly influenced a generation of intel officers to consider the paranormal. For instance, Major General Albert Stubblebine, head of Army intelligence in the early 1980s and a champion of remote viewing, was reportedly a believer in some of Puharich's theories like psychotronics. In the context of MK Offen, one could surmise Puharich was something of a spiritual predecessor to its more far-out pursuits. If MK Offen indeed forayed into the occult, it was following trails blazed by Puharich in the 50s and 60s. His presence at Edgewood in the 1950s is an interesting historical rhyme. The same base where Puharich spoke of telepathy later hosted MK Offen's drug trials. It suggests a continuum of thought that maybe someone in 1968 at Edgewood remembered Dr. Puharich's weird seminars and thought it worth revisiting. In summary, Andrea Puharich stands as a pioneering, if controversial, figure who brought occult and psychic ideas into U.S. military research long before it was mainstream to do so. He is often rumored to have been involved in MK Ultra sub-projects, though specific documentation is sparse due to code names. Regardless, his influence is such that any discussion of CIA occult connections brings up his name. He exemplifies the overlap of scientist, soldier, and mystic, exactly the blend that fuels MK Often lore. All right. We're going to get into Lieutenant Colonel Michael A. Aquino very shortly. So let me get a drink and take a breath. Again, I said there was a lot. I have like 11 pages left, folks. Lieutenant Colonel Michael A. Aquino, Army Psychological Warfare Officer and Satanist. If Puharich was the exemplar of CIA's flirtation with psychics, Michael Aquino, who lived from 1946 to 2019, exemplifies the military's brush with the occult. Michael A. Aquino was a career U.S. Army officer rising to a lieutenant colonel who specialized in psychological operations. Uniquely, he was an avowed practitioner of Satanism. He co-founded the Temple of Set and served as its high priest after splitting from Anton LaVey's Church of Satan in 1975. Aquino's name often surfaces in discussions about government and occult because he lived a dual life. By day, a PSYOP expert with top-secret clearance. By night, a self-professed black magician. Aquino joined the Army in 1968, incidentally the same year MK Often began, after graduating with a political science degree. He served in Vietnam with a Special Forces unit, Green Berets obviously, in a PSYOP capacity. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, Aquino held various positions, including NATO liaison and instructor, always in the realm of intelligence or psychological warfare. Notably, in 1980, he co-authored a pivotal paper entitled From PSYOP to Mind War with Colonel Paul Vallely. Oh, that guy was like on Fox News all the time. That's weird. Anyway, this paper argued that future wars would not be won by bombs, but by mind war, influencing the enemy's mind and will to fight using psychological and electromagnetic techniques like propaganda, broadcasts, and possibly directed energy to disrupt mental processes. Although mind war was an internal concept piece that echoes the kind of goals MK Often had in a non-occult sense, to incapacitate or influence adversaries without traditional force. However, what truly set Aquino apart was his open identification with Satanism. He joined Anton LaVey's Church of Satan in 1969 while still a young officer. By his account, this did not conflict with his Army duties. His superiors apparently tolerated it as a personal belief, at least initially. In 1975, Aquino had a schism with LaVey over philosophy and ritual, leading him to found the Temple of Set, a more theistic, satanic organization that worships Set, an Egyptian deity, rather than just embracing Satan as a symbol. The Temple of Set became an officially recognized church, and Aquino led it for decades. He was quite public about it, appearing on talk shows in full ceremonial regalia to explain his beliefs. Within military and intelligence circles, Aquino was both respected for his intelligence and viewed with suspicion by some due to his occult connections. He had a PhD in political science, was regarded as an extremely bright officer, and his work in PSYOP was cutting edge. It's known that he had a stint at DIA as a reserve attaché in 1981, giving him exposure to the psychic research program, which by then was under DIA. Indeed, Aquino was aware of the remote viewing program and, as mentioned, criticized it as ineffective. In his book, Mind War, he observed that the Army's attempts at psychic warfare had failed scientifically, a stance that surprisingly aligns him with skeptics despite his occult leanings. This nuance is crucial. Aquino distinguished between occult as a spiritual practice and psychic powers as a military tool, not automatically endorsing the latter. Okay, so Aquino's open Satanism eventually made him a lightning rod. In the satanic panic era of the late 1980s, he was falsely accused of heinous crimes, most infamously allegations of child abuse at the Presidio Daycare Center in San Francisco, where he had been stationed. The accusations were never substantiated. Law enforcement cleared Aquino and no charges were filed. But the ordeal cast a long shadow to many conspiracy theorists. The allegations, though unproven, cemented Aquino as a sinister figure bridging government mind control and occult ritual abuse. Aquino himself maintained his innocence and argued that he was targeted due to his religion. The case did drive him to retire from active duty in 1990, presumably because the negative press made his position untenable despite lack of evidence of wrongdoing. Michael Aquino was not directly involved in MKUltra or MKOffin. Those were before his time or outside his agency purview. However, in the 1980s, he did become tangentially involved with a remote viewing Stargate program. For example, he was acquainted with Major Ed Dames and others in the Grow Flame unit at Fort Meade. Some insiders recount that Aquino attended at least one gathering with the remote viewers, and he reportedly attempted a remote viewing session himself, but found it wanting. As per one Substack summary, Aquino does not appear to have worked at the SRI portion of the RV program and may have rankled some feathers by publicly dismissing RV as ineffective. So rather interestingly, Aquino's occult stance did not translate to support for the government's ESP research. He seemed to prefer more direct psychological methods, propaganda, fear inducement, etc., akin to what a PSYOP officer would use. Where Aquino does conceptually link to MKOffin is in the notion that intelligence agencies were willing to consider occult or arcane ideas. In the timeline given by Kenneth Haidt, MKOffin is about when Army intelligence officer Aquino joins Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, by the way. Haidt juxtaposes those events, hinting that by the late 60s, early 70s, even military officers were exploring occultism, reflecting a culture where the occult had penetrated the defense sphere's imagination. Indeed, the Temple of Set in the 1980s attracted a number of Army and some intelligence community members seeking an alternative spirituality. This raised eyebrows about potential influence on military thinking. Some conspiracy authors insinuate that Aquino might have inserted occult concepts into PSYOP or mind control programs, for instance. His Temple of Set was very interested in psychodrama and ritual as tools of self-transformation, which parallels how psychological operations aim to shape perception. But there's no evidence that the Army formally incorporated any of Aquino's occult practices. Nonetheless, Aquino's presence gave fuel to those who suspect a nefarious undercurrent. Quote, if a Satanist was a high-ranking PSYOP officer, could he have used black magic in military programs? End quote. This question is often asked by conspiracy theorists. The factual answer appears to be no, not in any sanctioned way. Aquino's Mind War paper, for example, though it uses somewhat esoteric language, advocates scientifically grounded techniques like elf wave generation rather than spells or rituals. He essentially saw technology and psychology, not demons, as tools of future warfare. Ironically, that places him closer to a rationalist approach despite his mystical religion. In interviews and writings, Aquino said his satanic beliefs were personal and did not conflict with serving the U.S. Indeed, he took an oath to the Constitution, and he argued one can be an ethical Satanist and loyal officer. Among those who study these programs, Aquino is regarded as a provocative figure who embodies the edge cases. He added legitimacy in a sense to the idea that occult ideas existed within the military. After all, he was a credentialed officer openly embracing occult philosophy, something unthinkable in earlier decades. Some have speculated that his interest might have led him to review MKUltra, MKOffin documents, or that he knew of undisclosed experiments. There's no direct proof of that. However, there was at least one FOIA request in 2004 specifically asking the CIA for files on Michael Aquino and the Temple of Set in various mind control projects. The fact that researchers lump him in with MKOffin and FOIA requests show how he's perceived as part of that mosaic, even if by chronology he wasn't. To summarize Michael Aquino's profile, he was a brilliant but controversial Army mind war specialist who brought legitimacy to occultism in military circles, but by his personal example. He did not run MKOffin or MKUltra, but his career intersected the tail end of these endeavors. His Temple of Set involvement, combined with his senior clearance, made him a figure of endless intrigue. In the narrative of Cold War occult programs, Aquino represents the internal interest, the idea that some within the defense establishment personally dabbled in occult practice, lending plausibility to theories that the institutions might explore it as well. And unlike Puharich, Aquino was an insider to policy, writing concept papers like Mind War. Thus, while evaluating MK Ultra, we consider Aquino's presence as an indicator of the era's open-mindedness to esoteric ideas among some defense and intellectuals. His legacy is twofold. One, in official history for influencing psychological operations thinking, and two, in fringe history as a supposed architect of satanic government mind control, an accusation not borne out by evidence but popular in some circles. Both Puharich and Aquino, in their very different ways, illuminate the human element of these programs, passionate individuals whose personal beliefs in the paranormal or the satanic brought an extra dimension to Cold War intelligence efforts. Whether they were mavericks or the norm is debatable, but they certainly make the story of MK Ultra and related projects far richer and more complex. So, occult and esoteric influences on U.S. intelligence in the Cold War. Why were agencies like the CIA and Army in the 1950s to the 1970s drawn to what we might call occult or esoteric subjects? To fully understand MK Ultra and its ilk, one must grasp the mindset of the Cold War. A time when the stakes, nuclear annihilation, ideological domination, were so high that almost any idea, no matter how strange, was worth investigating. If there was a chance, the enemy might do it first. Occult and esoteric beliefs found their way into U.S. intelligence considerations for several interlocking reasons. First, there was a perception of a psychic arms race. By the late 1960s, there was genuine concern that the Soviet Union was heavily investing in parapsychology and psychotronic research. Reports, some accurate, some exaggerated, reached the West that Soviet scientists were studying ESP, telekinesis, and even trying to weaponize psychic abilities. For example, the case of Nina Kulangina, a Russian woman who ostensibly could move objects with her mind, made waves. U.S. defense analysts couldn't conclusively debunk it, and thus had to consider, what if it's real? A 1972 Defense Intelligence Agency report spoke of a Soviet psycho-energetic threat. Similarly, rumors circulated that USSR spent millions of rubles on psychic research each year. This led to an ESP gap fear, akin to the missile gap fears. The reaction was predictable. U.S. intelligence felt compelled to catch up. If the Kremlin was recruiting psychics, the CIA could too, even if privately many agents were skeptical. This dynamic directly fueled the Stargate remote viewing program and indirectly validated looking into any unusual human ability or influence, occult included. In other words, it became a matter of national security pragmatism. We can't afford to ignore this area if our adversary is exploring it. Woo! Then, of course, you have historical precedents like Nazi occultism. Occult ideas also had a peculiar resonance due to the legacy of World War II. It was known that certain high-ranking individual Nazis, like Heinrich Himmler, had an interest in astrology, the Holy Grail, and Aryan mysticism. The Nazi Occult Bureau lore, while often exaggerated, was taken seriously enough that Allied intelligence noted it. After the war, as the U.S. brought over Nazi scientists in Operation Paperclip, some fringe theories came along or were at least documented. There is an anecdote that U.S. intelligence even studied Nazi astrological propaganda to see if astrology could affect public morale. This isn't to say the U.S. became a cult because the Nazis did, but the awareness that an enemy had dabbled in it kept the topic on the table. Plus, the early CIA and military intelligence cadres in the 1950s were aware of projects like the Stargazer program, a rumored World War II British intel astrology project. By the 1970s, people like Michael Aquino visiting Wewelsburg Castle, Wewelsburg Castle, which was Himmler's supposed magical HQ for inspiration, shows that the symbolic power of occult and warfare was alive, at least in individuals' minds. Then you also had cultural and counterculture influences. Domestically, in the 1960s, counterculture boom made occult and esoteric topics mainstream. The CIA and Army could not have been ignorant of the explosion of interest in Eastern mysticism, psychedelic spiritual exploration, witchcraft revival, and New Age beliefs in American society. Some CIA staff themselves were surely curious. Recall that in MK Ultra's LSD experiments, many CIA employees took LSD. Some, like Agent Al Hubbard, became almost mystical evangelists for it. As the public explored consciousness expansion, transcendental meditation, astral projection, etc., it's likely that a few open-minded intelligence of officers thought, is there something here we can use? Occult ideas were in the air. By 1970, you had best-selling books in the Bermuda Triangle, The Age of Aquarius, Meme, and people bending spoons on TV. This cultural saturation could lower skepticism within agencies and at least make them open to trials. M.K. Offutt's alleged recruitment of fortune tellers and witches occurred in 1969 to 1971, right when the Woodstock generation had made tarot cards and witch covens almost fashionable. An army officer in 1950 might scoff at consulting a witch. In 1970, he might think, well, stranger things have happened. Let's see. In short, the milieu of the late 60s, early 70s eroded the taboo around occult subjects, even in bureaucratic settings. Additionally, you had direct interest by certain intelligence leaders. Sometimes it comes down to personalities. We've seen that Dr. Stephen Aldrich, CIA/ORD, had a background in artichoke and might have personally been more intrigued by fringe science than his predecessor, Gottlieb. Also, CIA's Office of Technical Services, OTS in the 1970s had individuals like Dr. Christopher Kit Green, who quietly kept tabs on paranormal claims. He's the head of the Weird Desk at that time. Meanwhile, in the Army, Major General Stubblebine in the 1980s was famously gung-ho about walking through walls and trading Jedi warriors. He was an advocate for the remote viewing unit and other psychokinetic experiments. These people at high levels gave institutional cover to exploring weird topics in M.K. Offutt's time. If we consider that Helms allowed it and funded it, that implies Helms, though by no means an occult believer, was willing to let his science advisors roam free. Sidney Gottlieb himself was an odd character, known as a poisoner. He also had a spiritual side. In later life, he became sort of a hippie goat farmer. He enjoyed the nickname Black Sorcerer, partly for his clandestine skill, but some anecdotes say he hosted hypnotist gatherings and was open to mysticism. Gottlieb once allegedly experimented with a microwave voice-to-skull device to project sounds into an adversary's head, something that borders on science fiction or techno-occult, as one might say. So leadership, tolerance, or fascination mattered. Then there was psychological warfare value of occultism. There's a more practical angle too. Even if the occult isn't real, belief in the occult can be exploited. Psychological warfare planners have long recognized that enemy troops or populations might have superstitions that can be used against them. For example, during the Vietnam War, the U.S. executed Operation Wandering Soul, where they played eerie sounds purportedly of dead Viet Cong ghosts in the jungle to terrify superstitious fighters. Many Vietnamese Buddhists believe unsettled souls wander at night. This is a classic psyop leveraging occult belief. Likewise, if American intelligence knew that, say, an African dictator consulted witch doctors, they might attempt to plant a prophecy through an agent. There were indeed rumblings that CIA agents in the Congo spread rumors of being immune to bullets via magic during operations in the 60s. Thus, programs like M.K. Offutt could have had a mandate to study occult beliefs in foreign cultures to inform psyops. And M.K. Offutt's subtask could have been, for instance, examining voodoo practices to see if inducing fear of curses can weaken an enemy leader's support. We do know that CIA in Latin America looked at studying psychological preconditioning, which involved leveraging local folktales, like making villagers think a particular mountain was haunted to hide an operation there. So the occult as a tool for influence was on the menu. In fact, Kenneth Haight's article suggests M.K. Offutt might have been at least partly analyzing occult groups as a cultural phenomenon outside of the drug focus. If true, that's a very direct occult-influenced intelligence interest. Then there's Cold War ideology and the unknown. The Cold War was fundamentally a clash of ideologies, capitalism versus communism, but it had a quasi-religious fervor. Each side cast the other in almost demonic terms. It's not surprising that language of possession or brainwashing took hold. Some American evangelists literally described communism as a satanic force in those years. Conversely, the Soviet propagandists decried Western decadence, including occultism. Ironically, intelligence agencies, usually secular, got pulled into quasi-spiritual domains as they tried to combat red psychology. Some commentators at the time noted a cult-like aspect to both superpowers preparing for Armageddon, which involved nuclear war planning. In this charged atmosphere, exploring fringe spiritual realms could also be rationalized as understanding the enemy's mindset or discovering new ideological weapons. For example, the U.S. Army's interest in human potential movement techniques like EST, primal scream therapy, etc., for resilience training was an outgrowth of this atmosphere, blending psychology with quasi-spiritual personal growth to create more effective soldiers or spies to outdo the regimented communist man. Then there's declassified evidence of occult consideration. Now that decades have passed, some files have come out showing just how far the U.S. went. A startling example, a 1975 intelligence report on potential Soviet occult warfare suggested scenarios like using telepathic hypnosis or astral projection for espionage. Another in the 1960s, the CIA's counterintelligence staff studied UFO reports for possible psychological warfare use, as revealed by the 1990s declassification of the Robertson panel findings. While UFOs are distinct from occult, they fall into the esoteric category, and indeed CIA was interested in UFO beliefs as a mass control variable. For instance, could UFO scares be engineered to influence populations? Many UFO researchers tie MK often into this, hypothesizing a connection to study UFOs, UFO cults, or contactees. Again, evidence is thin, but that it's pondered shows how anything fringe was fair game. To wrap up, during the Cold War, occult and esoteric ideas influenced U.S. intelligence mainly through fear of Soviet advances and a willingness to experiment beyond the bounds of orthodox science. The intelligence community took a temporarily open-minded approach. Open your mind, but watch your back could have been the motto. They opened the door to the occult just enough to see if something useful slithered out. By the end of the Cold War, much of this interest had faded as results proved lackluster and the scientific rigor reasserted itself. The 1996 dissolution of Stargate, and the earlier termination of drug programs indicate a retreat to more conventional methods. But for a couple of decades, the veil between national security and the supernatural was tantalizingly thin. MK often stands as a testament to that peculiar moment when CIA analysts and army colonels might consult a medium or douse a witch's brew, not because they believed in magic per se, but because what if it worked and the other side beat them to it? So in conclusion, Project MK often remains one of the more enigmatic chapters in U.S. intelligence history, a program born from the legacy of MK Ultra, reaching into the realms of psychedelics and possibly even sorcery, and then snuffed out just as oversight and public scrutiny caught up with the intelligence agencies. Through this deep dive, we've drawn a picture of MK Often's origins, objectives, operations, and terminations based on the best available evidence. In doing so, we have distinguished between the well-documented facts, a joint CIA-Army drug testing program in the 1960s aimed at behavior modification, and the speculative lore that has grown around it. Tales of black magic and demonic consultations, which, while captivating, rely on scant proof. What we know with confidence is that MK Ultra was fundamentally an exercise in applied toxicology and behavioral science. In a Cold War context, it extended the work of MK Ultra by systematically testing new chemical agents on both animals and human volunteers, prisoners, and soldiers, building a database of tens of thousands of substances. Its goals were as practical as they were unsettling: to find chemical means to alter or disrupt the human mind, whether to incapacitate a target or to defend against an enemy's attempt to do the same. The program yielded copious data and likely advanced pharmacological knowledge, some of which no doubt found later use in fields like riot control agents or medical sedatives. Yet, like MK Ultra, it did not deliver a mind control panacea. By early 1973, under pressure of impending reforms, MK Ultra was abruptly terminated, and its records consigned to discretion on orders of CIA leadership. The secrets it held, both scientific and perhaps arcane, nearly vanished into oblivion, save for a few surviving documents and the recollections of those involved. What remains ambiguous is the extent to which MK often ventured into true occult research. No declassified document explicitly shows CIA officials casting spells or summoning spirits under MK Offen's budget. However, credible sources like John Marks do hint that ORD under Aldrich at least considered some exotic avenues, such as the search for a stroke simulation drug, which veered into folklore, the Haitian zombie poison. And accounts from writers like Gordon Thomas, though unverified, underscore a truth about the area, that the barrier between hard science and occult superstition was more permeable than we might expect in a government program. It is plausible that at a minimum, MK often researchers consulted fringe practitioners or studied occult phenomena in an exploratory fashion, even if it never became a main thrust. In psychological warfare training around that time, officers were indeed taught to understand enemy cultural superstitions, so an MK often analyst picking the brain of an astrologer or witch for insights on human suggestibility is not far-fetched. In terms of assessing credibility, we find that the well-documented parts of MK often stand up to scrutiny. FOIA releases and Senate investigations corroborate each other on the basics. Meanwhile, the more outlandish claims lack corroboration and likely reflect the personal anecdotes or imaginative reconstructions of authors operating without access to primary sources. It's telling that even within CIA, when asked in 1977 about behavioral research files, including parapsychology, the agency acknowledged dozens of boxes of material, indicating they had looked at almost everything, but subsequent revelations of that material through the 1990s and beyond still show an emphasis on drugs, hypnosis, and gadgets, not grimoires and pentagrams. Therefore, while we cannot entirely dismiss the occult anecdotes, because in intelligence sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, we must label them speculative and treat MK often primarily as a pharmacological program with perhaps a fringy side project or two. Comparatively, MK often's legacy is quieter but akin to MK Ultra's in cautionary value. Both programs exemplify how easily ethics can be sacrificed on the altar of national security. Scientists who, under other circumstances, would be advancing medicine instead administered harmful substances to unwitting or vulnerable subjects. The fact that MK often's human trials involved prisoner volunteers at Holmesburg, which was a captive population with constrained consent, and young soldiers who likely did not understand long-term risks, is a stark reminder of the abuses in the name of research. The termination of these programs in the 1970s and the ensuing regulations, like the establishment of institutional review boards for human test subjects, research across government agencies, were direct responses to such excesses. In that regard, MK often, MK Ultra, and their kin left an important reformative impact. They forced the intelligence and defense establishments to confront the moral limits of experimentation. Conversely, the foray into paranormal research like Stargate that paralleled MK often left a more ambiguous legacy. It neither covered itself in glory nor disgrace, rather it highlighted an interesting character where an intelligence apparatus tried to systematically investigate the impossible. In recent years, this legacy has reemerged in surprising ways. For instance, declassified reports in 2017 show that the Defense Department's UFO research program, ATIP, looked at things like warp drives and psychic phenomena, indicating that the spirit of exploring the fringe never fully died. MK often's story thus resonates today as we see renewed interest in phenomena at the edge of science, from consciousness studies to unidentified aerial phenomena within defense circles. The big difference, modern efforts come with far more transparency and scientific peer review, hopefully avoiding the ethical pitfalls of the MK often era. Key figures like Andrea Puharich and Michael Aquino personify the intersection of occult and intelligence that MK often symbolizes. Puharich showed how a scientifically trained mind could earnestly chase mystical ideas under government aegis. Aquino demonstrated that even within the ranks of the military, alternative spiritual beliefs found a foothold, and that understanding psychological influence sometimes meant engaging with the archetypes of good and evil, fear and fascination that occult symbolism embodies. Their profiles, as discussed, remind us that behind every program are individuals, often colorful, sometimes extreme, whose personal convictions can steer projects into novel territories. In conclusion, MK often stands as a fascinating, if murky, footnote in Cold War history, where the urgency to secure the mind against all threats led down both scientific and supernatural paths. It underscores that adage that truth is stranger than fiction, had one suggested in 1940 that by 1970, the U.S. government would be testing hallucinogens on prisoners and consulting psychics about Soviet intentions, it would have sounded absurd. Yet by the height of the Cold War, these things happened or were seriously contemplated. M.K. Offutt's tale is thus a narrative about the unbounded anxiety and ingenuity of the Cold War psyche, a time when confronted by an unknown and seemingly limitless enemy, we responded with an almost mythic ambition to conquer the unknown in ourselves and the world around us. From an evidence-driven standpoint, we emerge with a portrait of M.K. Offen as a late-stage MK Ultra offshoot focused on drug-based mind manipulation, entangled in the zeitgeist of occult curiosities, but anchored by the realities of toxicology experiments. We have highlighted where facts end and conjecture begins, given each their due weight. In doing so, this report not only clarifies what MK Offen was, but also why it has the ending mystique it does. It was a product of its time, a time when science, paranoia, and a dash of mysticism mixed in the crucible of national security. Studying MK Offen today offers more than just historical trivia. It serves as a sober reflection on intelligence methodologies. It prompts questioning about how intelligence agencies adapt to emerging, even fringe ideas, how they balance open-mindedness with rigor, and how they uphold ethical standards under the pressure of existential threats. As we venture further into the 21st century with new frontiers, cyber psychology, AI mind manipulation, etc., the story of MK Offen is a cautionary tale of innovation without oversight. At the same time, it's a human tale of brilliant, bizarre individuals and the lengths they will go in the pursuit of knowledge and power. Ultimately, MK Offen was terminated and largely buried, but its ghost, much like the restless psyche it sought to disturb, continues to haunt the imagination. And perhaps that is the final irony. A program rumored to summon demons wound up becoming a kind of demon itself in the American consciousness, a specter of what happens when the dark arts and dark ambitions of intelligence work converge. The truth of MK Offen may be far more mundane than the myths, but the fact that the myths exist and persist speaks to the deep cultural chord this subject strikes. In casting light on MK Offen, we better understand both the dangers of unrestrained clandestine science and the allure that the unknown holds, even for those whose job is to know everything. And that concludes the prepared remarks, or the prepared portion of this radio show. Man, that was a lot. I'm like sweating. That just is way too much. Let's see if I'm literally gonna race through these because I have about 6 minutes left. All right. Okay, Fred's making an app that makes short videos. Johnny Topside is saying the government seems nervous lately. They've been nervous for a while. Yeah, I think so. I think they know. Spiritual sentience, like they know we're coming for them, Johnny. Logan Clark writes all these drug testing programs and no one ever reaches out. Johnny Topside said, I had a dream about dolphins last night and an orca. Okay, so Spiritual Sentence says, dreaming of dolphins spiritually symbolizes connection, communication, happiness, and gentle guidance, representing the balance of intellect and emotion. While orcas' spiritual meaning often center on powerful leadership, strong community, family protection, and transforming your personal strength. Now, I don't know what ibogaine is, actually. I would have to look it up, but I don't have much time left. I have like 5 minutes. But tetrodotoxin is the zombie powder. That's the one from the Serpent and the Rainbow. All right, Logan's already on it. Apparently, ibogaine is a hallucinogen, but it makes you super suggestible, he says. Interesting. It helps with opioid addiction. Did not know that. All right. I am just going as fast as I can. Jilly Bean is saying, does MK Ultra, MK Often type testing still exist in the American? Yeah, probably. I would be surprised if it didn't. Did they experiment with BZ as well from the movie? Yes, definitely. That's the delirium drug that we talked about. Jilly Bean. Yeah, I mean, like currency is it's a belief. That's all it is. It's a religion. If we didn't ascribe value to money, the financial system would collapse. All right, I am just racing through here. Yeah, my apologies for racing through this, but again, I have like 2 minutes left, and I am exhausted after going through that. Oh, we're a loosh farm, apparently. Spiritual Ascension says we're a loosh farm. Hey, Joe Fox, good to see you, my friend. Okay, so Spiritual Ascension is saying I'm currently reading the Ugaritic Cycle of Baal, aka Baal, aka Baal Allah, or sorry, aka Enlil or Enlil. Yeah, peer review is how they discredit you. Hey, thank you, NECA, who's saying important conversation to have. Too few are going there. Big thumbs up. Thank you, my friend. Hey, thank you, Heidi. Yeah, it's my 85th uh radio episode. I have another, I think, 420 episodes of interviews that independent of that they're already up, but not all of them have aired because I like to keep a bit of an inventory. Hey, King James, good to see you. All in recent days, though, my views have tripled. Like my daily views have tripled. I don't know what's driving that, but I'll take it. It was after I had that owl experience. There's a whole other layer to that too, by the way. I haven't had time to get into it. I mean, it's already 9 o'clock my time, which means that I have to end. But let me just get through all the comments. Yeah, I needed. I had like 30 pages of material to blast through, so I needed extra. Hey, Pix, good to see you. Yeah, it was definitely an obviously branch off, but yeah, excuse me. Ah, did I find the Russian documents often was? I mean, no. I mean, even if I did, I wouldn't be able to do anything with them. Yeah, Kino. Oh yeah, definitely. There was Pair, the paranormal. I forget what it stands for at Princeton, and then Duke also had a lab, and the University of Virginia had one too. I think. Yeah, that's what it. Yeah, that's what I just. There were 149 sub projects. Yeah, and probably a lot of them weren't revealed. No, they won't have to pay anything back. That's for sure. Yeah, do thieves pay people back? No, that's what's spiritual. Oh, they're definitely going to be doing a digital currency. That's definitely coming. Yeah, Solite US Expat says congratulations on hitting 16,000 subscribers. Yeah, I appreciate that. I hit it fast too because I said like the when your views triple, your new and for new subscribers watching, thank you for subscribing. Just make sure you check periodically to make sure that your YouTube doesn't unsubscribe you. That's a thing on my channel, by the way. Oh man. But how many? How many things are there? Huh. So Spiritual Ascension writes, look into Kathy O'Brien's MK Ultra testimony. They did all sorts of messed up stuff to her and her daughter, hunting parties, SRA, etc. So freaking evil, so sad. Yeah, thank you, Spiritual Ascension. I am exhausted. Thank you, DJ Narcan. He's right. It's great breakaway. Michael Kenny said CIA developed SV40. Also, don't forget. Oh, that's simian virus. Yeah, yeah. Scott Ian saying I had a raptor dream last night. Someone left it with me chained to my arm. Yeah, I had another friend who texted me this morning that when he was driving home, there was an owl that flew over his car. There's a lot of that stuff going on. Open Door Policy Podcast. Thank you very much. So, Open Door Policy Podcast says they use psychedelics for PTSD treatment on vets here in Canada. It's going to be the standard for mental health care in the world very soon. Gateway is same. I think the U.S. federal government kind of put everything on. I forget what it's called, but basically wanted to prevent people from using it because it would hurt. Thank you. I appreciate that, Dusty. Hey, Blue Cruise, good to see you. I hope. I mean, I need to grow a lot faster to make this like a permanent thing. Hey, Pavlos, good to see you. Yeah, the previous one was, I kind of when I created the podcast, I kind of just wanted to get it done. Wanted to get it out there. And now that I've had time to like adapt it and improve it and all that stuff. All right. Thank you, Ginger Norseman. I appreciate that, brother. He writes, cheers for a cracking stream. Hey, UFO 411. Good to see you. All right. Oh, my Lord. Like 6 minutes over. So, everyone, have a great rest of your weekend. God bless you all, and have a fantastic next week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. I appreciate you. And until then, I got 2 episodes coming next week, and then I'll figure out. Oh, Illuminati Mind Controlled Slave by Fritz Springmeier is a great book. Huh. You have to check that out. Hey, yeah, hello back. All right. Anyway, I'll see you all again. 2 episodes coming next week as usual, and then I'll see you next weekend for a topic to be determined. I kind of come up with these things pretty quickly, so I'll figure it out at some point. Anyway, thank you all, and talk soon.